When it comes to the new year 2023, there isn't much to cheer about, economically speaking. That is because the news is grim when it comes to the state of the world economy. And that is an understatement. The World Bank has made a big cut to its 2023 growth outlook, saying that the globe is perilously close to recession. This is while going into the new year, the world was suffering from massive inflation, like in the EU and the US as examples. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at the reasons behind this gloomy outlook, how we got to this in the first place, and whether there are any signs that the world economy will improve anytime soon. Joining us to discuss this is Claude Menzies, researcher and political economy analyst who joins us from London. Claude Menzies, welcome. So, there's a barrage of bad news that's coming out, so it was worthy of us to try to explore that in this program. One of them is the World Bank making big cuts to its forecast, I guess for 2023. The global growth outlook it has stated is perilously close to recession, where it slashes economy or growth outlook for the economy to 1.7% for 2023 from 3% projection that it had said. What do you think is going on here? I mean, what can we say about this?
Well, I think good evening, and I think one should not be surprised by what's happening. What I find quite incredible is that anybody who follows the sort of the blow-by-blow accounts in the mainstream media doesn't seem to be able to stand back and look at the trajectory that we have been following. And this was predictable probably since the global financial crisis in 2008, primarily because of the responses there too. And we were warning as long ago as 7 years ago that we were heading for a global economic collapse. And last summer, when the governor of the Bank of England was suggesting that they were going to adhere to their 2% inflation target, that seemed somewhat laughable. The primary mechanisms that are causing this crisis have been long-standing. One is the excessive money supply. So there's been money supply or money printing by the central banks, the major central banks, ever since 2008, and that has accelerated in the last 3 years, since September 2019, specifically with the Fed. This whole false climate narrative that has been fabricated with the ESG diktat that all companies have to conform to is also a contributory factor because it's driven up energy costs. And I know that the World Bank cited Ukraine as being one of the factors in all of this, but actually it is nothing to do with Ukraine itself. It's to do with the sanctions. I was on a program in May 2022 where all of the commentators, including myself, were suggesting that the EU and primarily shot itself in the foot, but with America's encouragement, because it's the sanctions that has created this this acute problem that we have now. But having said all that, even without the Ukraine war, we would still be in this mess because the trajectory has been driving us here through excess money and energy policies that make no sense and have no basis in reality because there is no climate crisis.
All right, so I jotted down some of the things that you were talking about, and I want to ask you about this one particular one that is mentioned time and again, and you have also mentioned that time and again, and that is the fact that is somewhat, well, obscure or not really that clear when it comes to money supply, money printing, and the excess money. You know, we keep hearing about this, so the first question is, what is the theory behind it? But more importantly, where did the money go? I mean, you know, we're talking about a lot of money here that was pumped out by the central banks, correct?
Indeed. There was an article I wrote in an investment magazine, I think it was in 2018, where I showed a graph showing central bank, primarily the Fed and the ECB, and I think there may have been the Bank of England. And if you track the trajectory of the S&P 500, so it's an investment index of one of the main board indices of the American stock market, you could actually track that when the market weakened off, the central banks would intervene and create more money. And the mechanism that they used was primarily by basically taking bad debt off the commercial banks' books and basically just issuing more debt. And I don't know if you've seen more recently that in Japan, for example, they've actually gone to another stage of money creation, which is probably going to blow up in their face. So it's central banks
What stage
around
is
the
that?
world.
What kind of program are you referring to with Japan that you mentioned there?
Well, it's something I've not looked into more recently. It was reported on UK Column yesterday by David Scott that the Bank of Japan, not only have they increased their main base rate from 0.25 to 0.50, but they've undertaken a further buying program of government bonds. So they issue new government bonds and they take them on their own books. So it's just monetizing the debt. You ask where the money goes. The money, up until quite recently, until this inflation in the real economy started, has been going into asset prices, which is why we've seen stock markets, property prices, and all sorts of investments actually achieve record highs. What has happened, obviously, in the so-called COVID period, which is a whole other debate, basically they collapsed the real economy, so it wouldn't, all this money printing wouldn't actually appear in the real economy. Now that the COVID story has, if you like, rolled back because people are less amenable to being sort of intimidated into closing down their economic activity, there is now obviously activity, and we're seeing it creeping in on food prices, energy prices, etc. And let's not forget, along with this climate nonsense, they're also trying to destroy food production, particularly in Holland, where there has been a policy to actually stop people farming. And that is not exclusive to Holland. It's been a general trend across Western...
Why would they do that?
That's a very big question that has an answer. But essentially, we've been at war since 2001, and this is a war of the structure, which is those that believe that they can control the world centrally. They believe that there are too many of us on the planet, 7.8 billion or whatever the latest figure is. So they're looking to reduce the population and at the same time exercise control. And if you control food, then you control populations. I'm afraid that these sorts of ideas you will never see in a mainstream narrative because they just seem too fantastical. But when you look at the research that we've been involved in, this is a collaborative research project looking out from many different perspectives, shows that this is undoubtedly agenda. That's what COVID was about. That's what climate change is about. And this is what the, if you like, the destruction and the so-called greening of the planet is about, is to destroy farming and food production. And I'm not saying that agribusinesses or industrial scale farming should be protected, because there are better ways of doing things. But this is all about centralizing control, centralizing production, and reducing everybody's footprint, which effectively means that the carbon they are trying to reduce is the carbon life form, which is human beings.
Well, when you talk about the food, I'm looking down at what I have on food for to propose a question to you for, and I'm looking at food insecurity, where it's projected to reach a new peak, which was last experienced in 2007, 2008. And it cites a combination of factors, and it says the supply chain disruptions, COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, rising inflation, and high commodity prices. But the narrative that you just spelled out is somewhat different. It may contain that, but it's somewhat different. Clive, you're going into the fact that you are saying overall that you want, that you're saying that this is going to be centrally controlled in terms of, for example, food, and therefore there is a push for the population to decrease as a result of the way that food supply is controlled. If I understood you correctly, is that accurate?
Yeah, in small part. I think the two go together. There is a general. You only have to look across the world, more in the West than anywhere else, that they're actually reducing production of food. And one of the points that we made back in May when this sanctions regime started against Russia because of what's going on in Ukraine. The sanctions were bound to be self-destructive because Europe is heavily dependent on imports for food, and Russia has plenty of energy and it has plenty of food. So there is a concerted effort. There are certain areas of the states where you can actually be prosecuted for growing your own food. There are stories of people being arrested for feeding the hungry. I mean, these are small indicators of something much bigger. But this is all coordinated because if you look through every government, whether you're talking about Canada, New Zealand, Australia, countries across Europe, they're all adopting the same policies. Now, is it coincidence or is it planned? And our analysis would suggest that most of this is run by those that control the money system, i.e. those that control the central banks and the large commercial banks. And there is a concerted plan which brings together a lot of strands of what we've been talking about in terms of economic collapse, in order to create disruption, in order to reorder the world. I think there's a Latin phrase which escapes me at the moment, but it essentially means order out of chaos, and that is the strategy.
Sure. What a strategy. Well, let me introduce our guest, Elijah Magnier, journalist and political analyst who joins us from Brussels. Welcome. You've walked into, if I was walking into this conversation, I wouldn't know where to start. But Elijah Magnier, I'll start with one of the statements that amongst many bleak predictions for the world for the year 2023. This one I'm going to hit you with is from the IMF. 1/3 of the world economy expected to be in a recession. And it says it's because of the three big economies, US, EU, and China. And the bleak part of that, not that any of it was positive, says that half of EU is going to be in a recession. Elijah Magnier, what are we looking at when we're seeing all these bleak assessments that have been made? I'm sure you've read some of them, like this one from the IMF.
We are looking at the general recession that will hit the world, not only Europe or few part of the world, because the deterioration per capita income growth will be slower even in rich country, and that is due to several factors. Mainly, above all, is COVID, where the whole world was blocked for a very long time, and we were already told that we're going to be hit by an inflation. And secondly, are the US measures against countries like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia to start imposing sanctions and prevent the flow of oil and energy that can contribute to bring down the prices, because everything follows the price of the oil. We have seen in March when the petrol reached $120 and today is around 80, when budget around the world in rich oil country producers is set up between $40 to $50 a barrel. So if we bring that down already and we lift all these sanctions, that is the best hobby of the US to break the will of the population and impoverish the population. We have seen now that the US has adopted another policy, pushing the EU to commit suicide by imposing sanctions that have a devastating boomerang effect. And we in Europe are suffering greatly. We pay the bill of gas and electricity. I used to pay 70 euros per month. A few days ago, I paid 340, and I am one individual living in a small place. So we can imagine the effect of prices on everything else that is affected in the market, and we can't live.
So what do you mean when you say the U.S. is pursuing a boomerang effect type approach? Can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Well, Russia sells the gas to Europe and to China and to other countries with 30% discount. Today we're buying it at the price market plus 4 to 10% from Norway and from the US, but we're also buying it from Azerbaijan, from Algeria, but we're paying much more than the price that we used to pay. Moreover, Europe is not equipped to liquid gas that we are buying from the US and other places because we don't have these terminals. All the economy is based on that, and then we have to renew all the infrastructure. We don't have the money to do it, and that will cost a lot. And then we see many companies are closing their doors. And by closing the doors and seeing China that is buying the Russian gas at 30% discount of the Russian price, then the economy in Russia is going to be more attractive than the European industry because it's going to be much more expensive. The Chinese industry is going to be available at a very adequate price that we cannot afford because we're paying the price of energy much higher, and then we're paying also the price of food, the transport, everything else follow the price of the energy. So if the US stop playing with this very dangerous game by imposing sanctions on countries, by now pushing China to an arms race, by signing deals with Taiwan, with Japan, by increasing the Japanese GDP of weapons and armament, the double, by the UK signing another deal with Japan today. All that give us an indication that the US are really insinuating to the Chinese, we're going to come after you through Taiwan, and that will create tension the market is not going to like at all. This is why there will be a panic again in the market, where there will be many areas of insecurity, and that will increase the inflation. Hence, the recession is going to hit us all.
Clive Menzies, tell us the role that the U.S. and the U.S. economy actually plays in this whole thing, because we know on the one hand the U.S. financial system is integrated throughout the world in terms of how it can impact the flow of money, the dollar and its function, and of course what our guest there from Brussels was saying, the U.S. foreign policy approach is in terms of sanctions, for example, sanctioning countries like Russia, like China, and even Iran, and how this all emanates from the U.S. in some sense that perhaps affects the world economic growth. I mean, if that even makes sense for me to ask it that way.
Yes, I think it does. I mean, we've lived in a dollar world since the end of World War II, or Bretton Woods. And I think what's becoming increasingly obvious is that certainly in the last year or so, but probably for quite a long time before that, the dollar, its days are numbered. In addition, the US has basically been leaning on most other countries because of its military might and the strength of the dollar. And that is less potent than it used to be. I mean, by population, I think in terms of numbers of people, when you take in India, China, and other countries, the majority of the global population are against what America is doing in Ukraine, for example. And if one looks at what is happening, what is clearly evident from the Ukraine conflict is that Russian military sophistication could possibly exceed that of the US. There are certainly problems in the UK military in terms of morale, and political correctness has sort of crept in and reduced its effectiveness as a force. So I think we're witnessing a dying empire, but what we're seeing more than anything is plunder. So the Biden administration is heavily involved in the corruption. The Ukraine, even before March this year, had turned into some sort of gangster state where there's a lot of money laundering going on. You may be aware of the FTX debacle where this cryptocurrency outfit has been washing money through Ukraine back into the Democrat Party. Right. And we're seeing the end of plunder, and it's so obvious everywhere, but it's being led from the States.
Sure. Sorry to jump in here and cut you off, but I just want to give Elijah Magnier, and unfortunately we're out of time, the last question here. So Elijah Magnier, when you take a look at countries that have the energy, i.e. oil and gas, such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, we're looking at countries that are not pro-U.S., obviously, because these are being sanctioned. How much of a factor will that play in if they were to unite against the U.S. in terms of trying to regain that whole idea of globalization and not have what the world is experiencing now, which is this high energy prices, and that for there to be a balance. But of course, the U.S. would be left out. Under a minute, if you can.
Well, what the Americans are doing is allowing Venezuela to produce between 200 to 400,000 barrels of oil per day, enough for Venezuela to survive and for the Americans to take what they need because they import 700,000 from Russia. So they find alternative, but not enough for Venezuela to survive. If the US stop playing this game, because at the end of the day, the US is indebted with $33 trillion, but it is in dollars. They can print it any time, and they don't care really. So at the end of the day, their devastating policy and destructive policy is one of the major causes of what's happening in the world.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're just fresh out of time, but thank you, Elijah Magnier, journalist and political analyst, and thank you, Clive Menzies, a pleasure, researcher and political economy analyst. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Mikava Tawe and the team, it's goodbye.